22a, top of the page, second line. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention. 22a, top of the line, top of the page. Tashma ish shenadra b'nazir v'nitmas. She becomes a nazir. She becomes tamei. And then her husband nullifies the vow. So yesterday was machlokes here. According to one opinion, we had a debate whether the sacrifice she separated should be brought or shouldn't be brought. And now we have this brisa, which we've seen previously, is a different opinion that says that specifically the chatas is brought. Mevia chatas oif and mevia oila saif. She brings the chatas and she does not bring an oila. And obviously the question is what's going on here? Why should she bring anything if it works retroactively? And if it works henceforth, why doesn't she bring everything? So his guy is if you say the husband revokes it from now onwards, he should also bring an oila. So it must be that the husband revokes it retroactively. It's a retroactive revocation. If that's the case, so why are you bringing chatos? In other words, the Gemara is sort of putting it in between. You bring a chatas, but not an oila. So the Gemara says, Hachanami, you're right. The truth is that if you say me'eker akar, the truth is you shouldn't really bring anything. So why do you bring a chatas haif? We saw this Gemara previously. Hamani, this is the opinion of Rabbi Lazar Hakfar. Rabbi Lazar Hakfar, the time Rabbi Lazar Hakfar, Rabbi Lazar Hakfar taught, a nazir brings a chatos because he was chota ala nefesh. He sinned with a soul. Now this pasuk is actually referring to a nazir tomei bringing korban chatos. So what's the sin with the soul? The simple explanation is because he became tomei to a dead body. But Rabbi Lazar Kfar says with which soul did he sin? Because you're refraining from drinking wine, he's called a sinner, and therefore he needs a chatos. But it would seem logical. This person he causes himself pain by not being able to drink wine is considered a sinner. Somebody who pains himself from everything, certainly is also called a sinner. Okay, Tashma. Anyway, that's why we have drinks by the Kiddush. Tashma, the Tanya Vahedya. We learned clearly in the Brisa. Ha'isha shenadra b'nazir v'shama chaverta v'amra v'ani. A woman who commits to become a nazir, v'shama chaverta, and her friend heard v'amra, and she says v'ani, I should also be a nazir. Okay. So you have two women. First one says I'm a nazir. Second one says I'm also. And the husband of the first woman comes, he nullifies it. He mutaras v'chaverta asura. She is permitted and her friend is prohibited. Shmamina bal megas gayas. So this is a clear proof that the husband ends the neder from now onwards, and therefore the hatfasa of her friend was valid, and because her hatfasa was valid, she remains a nazir. So that is the resolution. Shmamina bal megas gayas. Okay. There's a second. Okay. Shimon says, Shimon says if this is an extension of the Brisa, some versions of the text excise this line. We have it in Taisus does include it in the text. And Reb Shimon is adding another point. He says, if he says to her, I'm like you. I'm sorry. If she says to her friends, so woman number 2 says to woman number 1, I should be like you. So then if woman number 1 is released, woman number 2 is released as well. Okay, now we have an interesting comparison here. we're on top of Chaf Beis and Beis, first word on the line. Marzutra Brei Rav Mari Omar. Marzutra, the son of Rav Mari, says, Hi, Hainu Jerome Barchama. This Gemara that we just saw about the opinion of Rav Shimon Harani Kamaisach would resolve the question of Ram Barchama. The boy Ram Barchama had the following question: Harei like basar zevach shlomim mahu. Okay, as follows: there's a korban called the korban shlom. Korban shlom is split. Some of it's sacrificed, some of it is eaten inside Jerusalem, inside the walls. The laws of the korban, it's typically understood that the part that's permitted to be eaten it's called mishulchan gavaya kazachon. It's machlokes in the Gemara, actually, whether kachim kalam is moment bailam or not. According to one opinion, the animal, those parts always remain in the possession of the owner. A regular sacrifice, that's, let's say, a korban oila, that's completely sacrificed, the owner does not own it. It's considered hektish, it's not owned by him. Whereas in the scenario of kachim kalam, according to some opinions, there is moment bailam. It belongs to the owner. But regardless, the animal's forbidden until certain components of the sacrifice are met, certain services are performed. The blood is sprinkled, basically, and that's the main one. That permits the rest of the korban to be eaten. So the guy says the meat of the shlomim. Is he talking about the meat after the blood was sprinkled, zerika was performed, and therefore the meat is permitted? Or are we talking about one second. Or we're talking about the main component of the sacrifice, the fact that it is a sacrifice ultimately, and therefore it remains. It's considered being matfis in the prohibited part as well. So the question is, if the guy is matfis with the boss or zivche shlomim, is that hatfasa in the main part of shlomim, which is prohibited, or is it in the meat of the shlomim that's after zrika and therefore permitted? Okay. Okay. Okay, so therefore, as follows, Marzuch is trying to say this previous brisa that we see that one woman does hatfasa to the previous woman. So we see that she's doing hatfasa be'ikr in the main. She's doing hatfasa in the second half of the neder. The fact that she's a nazir and not in her naziris. We'll explain this in a moment. 1 second. Okay, yeah, as follows. So the question here is, Mahu kimatfis inish be'ikra. Does a person make hatfasa in the ikra of the shlomim, which is the prohibited portion of it? Ayom b'tznana matfis. Tznana means the cold part or the permitted part. And they talk about something being hot and cold. The hot is like the prohibited state, like it's armed, it's hot. So is he being matfis in the hot part of the shlomim or the cold part, the permitted or the forbidden? So proving from our brisa, in other words, when the woman accepts to become a nazir, she remains a nazir. Woman number 2. Why is it? Because she wasn't matfis with her friend. She was matfis in the fact that her friend is a nazir. the original, and not the later part where her friend became permitted. So, in other words, a friend had a prohibited state in the beginning. Then her husband, woman number one's husband, nullified her neder, and therefore, her second stage was permitted, was cold, and yet we say woman number two remains prohibited. Obviously, what she was matfis was the prohibited state and not the permitted state. Okay, so that's sort of the proof to resolve the question of Rav Mari, that we presume he was matfis in the ikar, meaning in the prohibited part and not in the permitted part.
Why would the other woman say as a Nazir if it was revoked, the husband revoked the...
So it seems that so woman number one became a Nazir.
Right.
She said, I should be like that woman.
Okay.
And then woman number two said, I should be like that woman. And now woman number one's husband nullifies an neder.
Right.
So the question is, when she said she's going to be like that woman, did she mean the way she is in the current state?
Oh, the way she's going to be later. Okay.
Right, in the cold part or the hot parts? Okay. So the Gemara says, 1 second. Okay. So the Gemara is trying to resolve this question. The Gemara says there's no proof. Why not? Midami. Is there a comparison? Hassam, in that scenario, I'm sorry, in the question of Roman Barchama, Kivan the Amar Hareya like a boss of Zevach Shlamim, Afagav the Achar Shenizik Dami, Damai Matzi Achale Bachotz, Mikdish Kaddish. Okay, in other words, a woman, you have a woman here that says I should be Nazir. Question is, she says I should be like this Nazira, this woman who's a Nazir. This woman has a hot state and a cold state, right? The prohibited state is a state of Naziris. The cold part is when she's not a Nazir at all. Is there any sanctification that she has? No. She's a regular person. She's not a Dover HaNodar at all. Whereas in the scenario of Shlomim, we're dealing with two sanctified items. Your question is whether is it sanctified and a person is not allowed to eat it, or is it sanctified and a person is allowed to eat it? But even if it's sanctified and you can eat it, you can only eat it for 2 days and a night, and you have to eat it inside Jerusalem. So there is some sort of sanctification. So when a guy says to an item that has two states of kedusha, of sanctification, one is a severe state and one is a more lenient state. Does he mean to be matfis in the more lenient one or the more severe one? And that scenario is not analogous to a woman who has a state of permitted and prohibited. There's no reason why a person would make any hatfasa to a woman who's not a nazir at all. So therefore, the scenarios are incomparable. Okay, 1 second. Midam, is it comparable? Chasam kivin amar harei like a basar zevach shlamim. In the scenario of Raman Barchama. So the guy says it should be like the meat of a shlamim. Afagav la'achar shenizik dami matzi achalei b'chutz mikdash kaddish. Even though after Zrika you can eat it outside of the temple, but inside of Jerusalem, it's still a sanctified item. It's a spiritual item. Aval hachal, but in our scenario of a woman who became a nazir and then her husband nullified the nazir. If you say she took the cold part, meaning the portion where she is no longer a nazir, the husband nullified the neder, and therefore there's no reason to presume that anyone would make a hatfasa to a woman who has no sanctification at all, because she's completely not. There's no kedusha. She's not a dover HaNodar at all, so there's no reason to presume that anyone would do that. And that is the conclusion of this Gemara, that the proof is not valid. However, there's a second opinion that says, that the truth of the matter is they are it is an identical comparison, and the truth is that our brisa does resolve the question of Raman Barchama, that the ikra kamatfis, if you say it should be like the meat of a shlamim, you're like the meat of a shlamim. You're like the prohibited part of the meat, which means that they're accepting a neder of prohibition. a valid neder. We together? Okay. Okay. 1 second. Next Gemara. Amar law. She says to her friend, Hareini Nazira be'ikvach. I'm a Nazira in your heel, meaning along the steps the steps you walk, along your footsteps. Mao. Is that any different? Hareini be'ikvach b'kula milsa sharia. Hareini be'ikvach b'kula milsa. Does it mean I'm on your footsteps along the entire journey, including when your husband ended it, and therefore I'm not either a Nazir? Sharia, she's permitted. Or does it mean no? If the woman says I'm a Nazir in your pathway, it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that that if the first woman was permitted, she would also be permitted. It means that she has to accept Naziris just like the first woman, and if the first woman's released, she is not released. Tashma, let's examine this question. A woman who accepted Naziris and her husband says, and I'm also a Nazir. So in that scenario, the husband cannot nullify her vow. Okay, and we said 2 reasons why he couldn't nullify her vow, either because nullifying her vow in effect nullifies his vow, but that was according to the opinion that says me'eker akar, which is not how we resolved. We resolved megas gayas. He ends it from now onward, which means that if he nullified her neder, his neder would still be valid. The reason why he can't nullify her neder is because when he says that I should be not, when he agrees to her by saying va'ani, he's mekayim the neder. He supports the neder, and therefore he validated it, and that's why he can't nullify it. Okay. And the Gemara here is presuming that va'ani is like hareini be'ikvach. Okay, let's see this 1 second. Hareini be'ikvach, I mean, I'm going on your footsteps. If you say that hareini be'ikvach, it does a hatfasa be'ikar, in other words, in the core neder, in the core nazirus, which makes you always prohibited, even if the first person loses their nazirus because their husband nullifies it. 1 second. Okay, so then leifer la l'dida v'leikem didei. Why, if hareini be'ikvach is just in the ikar, meaning in the core neder, so why can he nullify her neder, and his neder, his nazirah stays valid? As if hareini be'ikvach says that I'm exactly like you, so then it would make sense even if you say Baal Megas Gayas, he still can't nullify the neder. In other words, even if you say a husband nullifies the neder from now onwards, if the word va'ani is like hareini be'ikvach, and hareini be'ikvach means I'm going to be exactly like you, which means that if you lose your nazirus, I also lose my nazirus, then it makes a lot of sense why the husband can't nullify the neder. The reason why he can't nullify the neder is because if he does, he's nullifying his own neder. Because va'ani is like hareini be'ikvach, and it means I'm doing what you do. Your neder is out, my neder is out too. It must be the kula demilsa matfas that hareini be'ikvach is saying. 1 second. One second. It's false. Yeah. Okay. So in other words, if hareini be'ikvach, like we said before, if hareini be'ikvach means I'm exactly like you, it makes a lot of sense why the husband can't nullify the neder. But if hareini be'ikvach means just the original nazirus, the husband should be able to nullify the neder, the nazirus, because he can nullify his wife's nazirus. His nazirus is still valid. So If you say Hareni Be'ikvach means just the core neder, which is the Naziris, so why can't he nullify her neder? And his neder is valid. It must be called the Milsamatvis. That Hareni Be'ikvach means everything. And therefore the husband can't nullify the vow because by nullifying his wife's vow, he's in fact nullifying his own vow. He can't nullify the vow. But getting back to the original question, if there are two women and one woman says Hareni Be'ikvach to the other, who first became a Nazir, and the first woman's husband nullifies her Naziris, then the second woman's husband's Naziris is also invalidated. Do you have the proof together? Gemara says, "Loy, not necessarily. The truth of the matter is that the hatfasa of Hareni Be'ikvach is exactly like saying Va'ani. It's Be'ikra. It's just in the Naziris. It's not whatever happens to her." 1 second. But over here, since she says me too, it's as if she says, 1 second. Yeah, okay, because he says Vani, I'm going to be like you, that's a validation of her neder. And therefore, because he validated the neder, if he revokes his validation, then he can nullify it. But in the absence of that, he cannot nullify it because he validated her neder. He can't nullify it anymore. Okay, together. Final Gemara in this Mishnah. Hareni Nazir Va'at. He says, I'm a Nazir. What about you? And she says, Amen, which is affirming his question. The answer is affirmative. Mefer Eshalom V'Shaloi Kayam. He can nullify her Naziris, and his Naziris remains valid. Ask the Gemara question for V'Raminu. Hareni Nazir Va'at. If a man says, I'm a Nazir, what about and you? V'Amra, and she says, Amen, affirmative. Shneim Asurim, they're both prohibited. They're both Nazirim. V'Im Lav, let's say, he says to her, I'm a Nazir, what about you? And she says, no, not a Nazir. So then what happens? Shneim Mutarim. Neshatola Nidra B'Nidra. Then they're both permitted because, in effect, what he's really saying is, I'll be a Nazir if you're a Nazir. Are you a Nazir? And she says, no, well, then I'm not a Nazir either. And this seems to contradict our Mishnah, because our Mishnah says that, our Mishnah seems to imply that he's a Nazir regardless of whether or not she accepts the Naziris. So Rabbi Yehudah says no. The truth of the matter is, it's true that he is saying, in effect, that their Naziris should be linked to each other. I'm a Nazir if you're a Nazir. But that still doesn't change the fact that he could still nullify her Naziris. And he remains a Nazir. In other words, when they accepted the Nazir, they did it together. It was a joint agreement. If she agrees, then I'll agree. But he could still nullify his neder. I'm sorry, he could still nullify her Naziris. Rabbi Yehudah Tana Mefer Shalav Shaloi Kayim. Rabbi Yehudah says it's not a contradiction. The truth is, you can add on to that brisa that he can nullify her neder, her Naziris, but his remains valid. Abai has an interesting resolution. Abai Omar, I feel time to get the tiny brisa. You can keep the brisa the way it is. Depends what happens. Amar law Hareni Nazir Va'at. Depends on how you framed it. In the brisa, he framed it, I'm a Nazir if you're a Nazir. Are you a Nazir? It's Katali Nidra B'Nidra, where he connected the two of them. Masisin Gamar can the Amar law Hareni Nazir. I'm a Nazir. Va'at, what about you? Va'at Mayim. And he says, what about, I'm a Nazir, what about you? She says, I am. If she says I'm not a Nazir, he's still a Nazir. If she says I am a Nazir, he can nullify her Naziris. So according to Abaya, in the case where they link their Naziris, he cannot nullify her Naziris because in effect he'd be nullifying his own Naziris. But in the scenario with where he says, I'll be Nazir if you're a Nazir or you a Nazir, and she says, I'm a Nazir, so then they're linked, and he can't nullify because nullifying hers is in effect nullifying his. In the scenario where he says, I'm a Nazir, what about you? Are you also a Nazir? And she said, if she says no, then he's a Nazir and she's not a Nazir. If she says, yeah, he could nullify her Nazirus without nullifying his own, without his own Nazirus being affected. Stop here. Have a great morning.
Be careful what you say. Yes.